If I was starting a podcast in 2024, here's exactly what I would do. And this is coming from someone like myself, where I've been in the podcasting space since 2015. I started my own show back then to running a podcast booking agency that I run now, and then even launching the REI Marketing Secrets podcast today. If I was looking back and I was thinking back to myself back in 2015, looking back 9 years now, if I could go back and start my podcast, what would I want to do better? What would I want to know? And that's exactly what I want to be explaining to you today in this video if you're watching on YouTube or if you're listening to this on the podcast. The first thing that I would do is I would make sure that I have a good quality podcast microphone. I would recommend if you're on a budget to get the blue snowball mic. That's going to run you about $50 on Amazon. I would recommend if you have a little bit more budget, get the blue Yeti mic. That's what I know and love to use, and that's what I'm currently using right now. Obviously, you can go further out and you can spend hundreds and thousands of dollars. I believe I bought this blue Yeti mic for 80, 90. I don't know. I don't know if it was that expensive, but maybe 100, $120. So you want to make sure you have a good quality podcast microphone. I recommend a good quality webcam. I found just between using a Mac, between using a PC, that just having a nice quality webcam just makes the images, and especially if you're doing a video podcast, just makes it come through just so much better. So I just get those two out of the way. Just plain simple budget, about $100 for the two of those. Now, when it comes to like planning the podcast, what I would do is I would make sure that I have a backfill of episodes. What this means is that I have episodes set in place where they're scheduled a couple of weeks out. So in case anything comes up in my life where I'm busy in my personal life, something comes up in my business, and I just don't have the time of day to have an interview, or maybe a guest cancels, whatever happens, something comes up, I have that backfill there set up where if I don't record an interview for a few weeks, they're still going to be going out there. I find so many podcasts just stop producing episodes because they're interviewing someone today, releasing the episode tomorrow, interviewing someone today, releasing the episode tomorrow. That's not the place that you want to be. When I launched the REI Marketing Secrets podcast, as an example, I had 10 interviews ready to go. I put out 5 the first day. I knew that that gave me 5 weeks worth of interviews. And over time, I've been able to build it out from there. If I was going back to myself and I had an interview podcast, which is what I had back in the day, where now it's half interviews, it's half me trying to provide helpful content, which is an episode that you're listening to or watching to today. I would want to interview guests that were successful but maybe weren't at their peak, if that makes sense. And the reason I say that is we had a couple of guests on early on the podcast that I was interviewing back in 2015, and it just wasn't that great. The interview just wasn't that good. Over time, you're going to become a better interviewer, especially if you're having guests on your show. But in the beginning, it can be a little just difficult. It can be a little uncomfortable. You're trying to get a feel for everything that's going on. And I just had a couple of guests that came onto our show that just I just did a butcher job with them. I felt terrible for bringing them on. One of the guests that we have was a successful author named John Gordon. He's wrote a bunch of different business books. I highly recommend checking them out. And when I was interviewing him, I just like butchered his bio so bad that he had to tell me how to read his bio for him. It was pretty awful. Now looking back, I wish I'd maybe interviewing people that I knew, folks that I had talked to before, people that I would have been a little bit more comfortable with. So that's one of the first things that I would recommend, is not trying to get the largest guests on your podcast right away until you become 5, 10 episodes in and you become a little bit more comfortable with interviewing. Outside of that, I would recommend knowing how to edit a podcast, whether you outsource it or whether you do it yourself. I would just watch tutorials on YouTube, and at the time I believe it's called Audacity on a PC. Eventually I got a Mac and I switched over to GarageBand. Just basic minimal edits. I wasn't trying to do anything professional. I just wanted to make it sound good, clean audio. I wasn't going through removing the ums and the ahs and different things like that, unless there was a part of the interview where it got cut off. Maybe the internet connection wasn't good and I had to piece the interview together, but I just knew the basics of that, so I could do it on my own, and I didn't have to outsource it. But again, if you do want to outsource it, that's perfectly fine. But I found as a beginner, I could definitely learn how to edit and produce a podcast on my own by just watching free YouTube tutorials. Outside of that, I would want to create a lot of social media content from my interviews. I didn't do that as much back in the day, and that's where I'm trying to make a strong push with the podcast that I'm now doing, the REI Marketing Secrets podcast. I find that I'm spending about 30 minutes on average with these guests, give or take 10 minutes, a 20-minute interview or a 40-minute interview, but 30 minutes is about the sweet spot. In that 30-minute interview, I could create literally 10 pieces of content, which would give me more than a week's worth of content to put out there on my social media, not including whatever else that I do. And I wish I had done that more often early. I find that guests will be receptive to that you have on your show. Not every guest will share the content that you created for them, but at least you'll be able to share the content on your own social media account. So it works out in that way. And I would highly recommend doing that. There's a tool that you can check out called Capwing. It's spelled Kapwing. I believe it's about $24 a month is what we pay at our company. And I find it just very helpful when it comes to editing content, editing videos. What the cool thing about it is I can upload a 30-minute interview. It takes the software about an hour or so, and then I'll spit out 10 different pieces of content from the interview. So I don't even have to go back through and listen to it to find the best spots. Because back in my day, when I was trying to create some of the social media content, I would listen to the entire interview, write down minute 21 second in to minute 23 minutes and 35 seconds in. And then I have to go through manually cut the interview and then share it. So there's just like a lot of work that went into it. So you don't have to do that as much now. So just to give you a quick recap of what we talked about so far, good quality podcast microphone and camera, or webcam, I should say. It doesn't have to be a professional camera, especially if you're first starting off. You want to make sure that you have a backfill of episodes. You want to make sure that you know how to edit the podcast or either outsource it. And you just want to make sure that you have good quality guests coming onto your show and that you don't want to burn the bridges too early on and just interview a couple of different people in the beginning that maybe you don't burn the boats on. And then really the biggest thing is just being consistent. Or I should also mention the social media aspect of it as well, producing the social media aspect. And it could be said with that is when the episode has gone live, just send an email off to the guest saying, hey, so-and-so, your interview has gone live. I can't tell you how many times I've gone on a podcast and I would have been more than happy to share the interview, but I never knew that the interview went live because the host had never told me until it was like 6 months later that I discovered it on my own. And at that point, it's a little weird for me to share an interview that I'd been on social media on 6 months ago. I know it's just a little strange to me. So I'd rather know of it, the day that I went out, or at least within a week of the interview going live. And then the last part is just being consistent. Being a podcast host or being a guest, whatever you choose to do, it's a lot of work. There's a lot that goes into it. And there's a statistic about 90% of podcasts don't make it past the 10th episode. And that's just due to a lack of consistency. So you just want to make sure, okay, if I'm starting my podcast, I'm going to be in it for the long haul. It's not going to be as easy as I think it's going to be. It's going to take a lot of work to get done. But I know over time, I'm going to get the benefits out of starting this podcast and growing professionally and as a person. I hope this was super helpful for you to give you a guide and an overview of podcasting for beginners in 2024.